Eva and Constance Gore Booth were born into a prestigious Anglo-Irish family. The Gore Booths owned Lissadell Estate, which was then based on 32,000 acres of land in County Sligo. And the sisters grew up in Lissadell House, which is a Greek Revival mansion with 70 rooms. So very prestigious background. Although they were born at a time of political unrest, certainly in relation to landlordism in Ireland. In 1879, when the girls were young, famine revisited the country and Sligo was hit particularly badly. Even Constance's parents ensured that any tenants in need of food were provided food free of charge. And this sense of responsibility to others less well off was to have a deep impact on Eva and Constance really right through their lives, but also gave them a sense of the responsibility that landlords had to tenants. Also, we have a sense of the girls' early life because, as was typical of the time, the girls were educated at home, so they spent their early days in Sligo and they learnt a lot about the area, the history and the heritage of that area. They were deeply influenced by Celtic mythology, most especially about Queen Maeve, the warrior queen, who is reputedly buried on the cairn of Knocknaree, not far from Lissadell itself. And later in life we see that Constance named her only child, her daughter Maeve, and Eva wrote numerous poems and plays in honour of the warrior queen. The two girls, Eva and Constance, would later of course reject their life and their lifestyle at Lissadell. Constance went off to study art, first in London and then in Paris, where she met her future husband Count Markievicz, and of course upon marriage that's where she acquired the title Countess Markievicz. Eva, while convalescing in Italy, was to meet a young suffragist from Manchester, Esther Roper, and she was to become her life partner. On her return to Sligo, it was then that Eva founded the very first suffrage organisation in Sligo, with Constance at the helm as the president. But shortly after this, both Eva and Constance left Lissadell for good, only returning briefly for holidays. Eva moved to Manchester, where she became very involved in trade union activities and worked amongst the working classes, of course a high population of which were Irish emigrants, and she worked with Irish emigrant women. And we see her working for women who were overlooked by normal mainstream trade unions because they were thought to be in jobs that were morally risky, like barmaids, factory workers, circus performers, pit brow girls. And although Eva and Constance distanced themselves from the Gore Booth family in Sligo, they remained particularly close throughout their lives. So what we know is that Constance made regular trips, regular visits to Eva in Manchester and helped her with her trade union campaigns. Possibly one of the most successful of these campaigns was in 1908, when there was a Manchester Northwest by-election. Constance went over to help Eva campaign against a really prestigious candidate of Winston Churchill, who at the time the Liberal Party were in power and they were going to introduce a licensing bill. A part of that licensing bill would actually exclude women from working in bars, in public houses, and therefore the two sisters organised what was a particularly vibrant campaign. They organised 4 white horses to drive a coach and them around the streets of Manchester. And we certainly know that this attracted huge crowds and was reported in different newspapers of the time. And we even have photographs of the images of Countess at the whip of this carriage. It was a very dramatic campaign, and one that was extremely successful. They actually orchestrated the defeat of Winston Churchill from that constituency in Manchester. He, of course, did receive another seat as an MP in Dundee later on, but they also successfully managed to secure the licensing bill protection of barmaids, so that actual extract that was extracted from the bill. So at the onset of World War I, Eva Gore Booth at that stage was living in London, and she became embroiled in anti-war movements and in support of conscientious objectors. She was unaware really at the time that her sister Countess Markievicz had become so involved in the Irish nationalist movement. And she read with horror one morning that actually Constance's body had been found in Stephen's Green after the Easter Rising fighting. Of course, she discovered that that was untrue fairly quickly, and learned then that Constance had been sentenced to death by firing squad. So she looked for a special travel pass to get to Ireland because, of course, at this stage Ireland was under martial law. She was granted permission to travel to Dublin, and she sought a reprieve of Constance's death sentence, which was, of course, commuted to life imprisonment at that stage. But when Eva arrived in Dublin, she was horrified at the accounts. First of all, that her friend, Frances Sheehy Skeffington, who was a pacifist and also a suffragist, had been killed by an illegal firing squad. Also, she arrived into Dublin the morning that her mentor, James Connolly, had been strapped to a chair and he had been executed by a firing squad. So she returned to London with these tales of the atrocities that had happened in Dublin, and she organised public talks to basically educate the people in England as to the atrocities of the British Empire and what was happening in Ireland. It was then that she was inspired to publish a special publication in honour of those who had died, and she looked to publish the last 3 acts from her play The Triumph of Maeve, which she published as The Death of Fionavar. Now, of course, we can see that The Triumph of Maeve is generally a pacifist play, but in this instance it can also be read that Eva was trying to get across the idea of the atrocities of war rather than condemning what had actually happened in the Rising. And we can see this by the fact of the beginning of the volume. She dedicates the play to the one who died for peace, who was easily identifiable as Frances Sheehy Skeffington, and also the ones who died for freedom. There's also a poem that she prints in front of the play, which honours the bravest of the brave, and she identifies these amongst others as Pearse, Plunkett, MacDonagh and Connolly. At this stage she asked Constance to illustrate the play, and of course Constance was incarcerated at the time for her place in the Easter Rising. She supposedly drew the sketches with a rook feather that she found in the prison garden, and Constance illustrated every page of the text. By the time of the publication, Eva was a highly respected and prolific author, so it isn't surprising that the publication gained a lot of media attention. In the Manchester Guardian, which was edited by Eva's friend C.P. Scott, a supporter of Home Rule but not an advocate of militarism, he hoped that the play would instil some kind of peace on the island of Ireland. But the New York Times dedicated actually a full page to a review of the play, and the reviewer pointed out what he considered to be an obvious paradox, that here we had a pacifism play illustrated by somebody who was involved in direct military action. But of course, the play really highlights the condition and relationship between the two sisters, but also the fact as well that we can have somebody who was fighting or opposed to World War I, but yet in support of the Easter Rising. So it is a unique play, certainly from Eva's point of view, but also the fact that Constance has been involved in illustrating it.